David had always been the kind of person who preferred his own company. Not because he didn't like people, but because people were complicated. They asked questions, wanted favors, and dragged you into their drama. At his job in the small architectural firm downtown, he kept things simple. Show up at 8, work on his designs, eat lunch at his desk, and leave by 6. No office politics, no water cooler gossip, no unnecessary friendships. It was a good system, and it had worked perfectly for 3 years. Then everything changed on a cold Monday morning in October. The email came from HR at 7:45. They were getting a transfer from their international office. Someone named Elena would be joining the team, and she'd be sitting in the empty cubicle right next to David's. He read it twice, sighed, and hoped this new person wouldn't be one of those chatty types who needed constant interaction. When Elena arrived that first day, David barely looked up from his computer screen. He heard her voice thanking someone for helping with her boxes, heard the sound of a chair being adjusted, a computer being turned on. He offered a quick nod when she glanced his way, then went right back to his blueprint designs. Professional but distant. That was the plan. For the first 2 days, it worked fine. Elena seemed equally uninterested in small talk. She focused on her work, took her calls quietly, and left David alone. Perfect. Exactly what he wanted. But on Wednesday afternoon, something strange happened. David was reviewing a proposal for a new client when Elena's chair suddenly rolled closer to his desk. He looked up, surprised. She was leaning toward him, close enough that he could smell her coffee. Her voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. "Don't submit that proposal," she said quietly. "The client is going to reject it anyway. Save yourself the time." David blinked. "Excuse me?" But Elena had already rolled back to her desk, her eyes fixed on her screen as if nothing had happened. David stared at her for a moment, confused. How could she possibly know what the client would do? She'd only been there 3 days. She didn't even work on his projects. He shook his head and went back to work. Weird, but whatever. Office people were always full of opinions. The next morning, the client called. They were going in a different direction. Proposal rejected. David sat very still at his desk, a strange feeling creeping up his spine. It was just a coincidence. Had to be. Clients rejected proposals all the time. Elena had probably just made a lucky guess, but then it happened again. The following week, David was preparing for a meeting with their boss, Mr. Chen. It was an important presentation about a potential project in Singapore. David had been working on it for weeks, and landing it would be huge for his career. As he gathered his notes, Elena's chair rolled close again. "He's going to offer you the Singapore job tomorrow," she whispered, her eyes serious. "But you shouldn't take it. Trust me on this. The company you'd be working with is in serious financial trouble. They'll go under in less than 4 months." This time, David turned to face her. "How could you possibly know that?" Elena just looked at him for a long moment, then rolled back to her desk without answering. David felt his heart racing. This wasn't normal. People didn't just know things like this, especially not new employees who barely spoke to anyone. He wanted to press her for answers, but something about the serious look in her eyes stopped him. That night, David couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what Elena had said. It was ridiculous, impossible. But what if she was right? What if there was something wrong with the Singapore company? The next day, Mr. Chen called David into his office. The conversation went exactly as Elena had predicted. The Singapore project was his if he wanted it. 6 months overseas, great pay, impressive addition to his resume. It was everything David had been working toward. "Can I have a day to think about it?" David heard himself say Dotmer. Chen looked surprised but agreed. David spent that evening searching online for any information about the Singapore company. He found nothing alarming at first, just the usual corporate website and press releases. But then, buried in a small business forum, he found a thread from someone claiming to be a former employee. They were warning people about unpaid invoices and strange financial decisions. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to make him nervous. The next morning, David declined the offer. His colleagues thought he was crazy. "Are you feeling okay?" one of them asked. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But David couldn't shake Elena's warning from his mind. 3 months later, the news broke. The Singapore company had filed for bankruptcy. They owed millions to contractors and employees. Anyone working with them was left scrambling. David sat at his desk, staring at the news article on his screen. His hands were shaking slightly. Elena had known. She'd known exactly what would happen weeks before anyone else. He turned to look at her. She was typing away at her computer, calm as ever. When she noticed him staring, she gave him a small, knowing smile, then went back to her work. From that moment, David couldn't stop thinking about Elena. Who was she? How did she know these things? He started paying more attention to her, watching for clues. Over the next few weeks, he noticed something disturbing. Elena would occasionally whisper things to other people too, though not as often as she spoke to him. She'd lean close to someone in the break room and say something quietly. She'd catch someone in the hallway and have a brief, hushed conversation. And every single time, whatever she'd said seemed to come true. She told their accountant to double-check his tax filings. 2 days later, he found a major error that would have cost him thousands. She warned the receptionist about a package delivery scam. The very next day, someone tried to trick the receptionist with that exact scam. She mentioned to a colleague that his car's brake light was out. He hadn't even noticed, but when he checked, she was right. It was like Elena could see things that hadn't happened yet, or knew secrets that no one had told her. David became obsessed. He started finding excuses to work late, hoping to catch Elena alone and ask her directly how she did it. One Thursday evening, his chance finally came. The office had emptied out except for the two of them. David rolled his chair over to her desk. "Elena, I need to ask you something." She looked up, not seeming surprised. "How do you know all these things?" He asked directly. "The client rejections, the Singapore company, all of it. It's not normal. People can't just predict the future like this." Elena studied his face for a long moment. Then she glanced around the empty office, making sure they were truly alone. She leaned forward, and David found himself leaning in too, drawn into the familiar ritual of her whispered secrets. "I can't explain it all right now," she said softly, "but I need you to trust me about something important. In 2 weeks, our company is going to be approached about a merger. They're going to present it as a great opportunity, lots of promises about growth and security. Don't believe them, push back. Ask the hard questions. Because if this merger goes through the way they're planning, half the people in this office will lose their jobs within 6 months. David couldn't get Elena's words out of his head. A merger? Job losses? He wanted to dismiss it as just another wild prediction. But after everything else she'd been right about, he couldn't ignore it. That weekend, he barely left his apartment. He kept replaying their conversation, trying to make sense of how Elena could possibly know these things. Monday morning came, and David arrived at the office earlier than usual. He watched Elena carefully as she went about her day. She seemed so normal, so ordinary. She made coffee in the break room like everyone else. She attended meetings and took notes. She laughed at someone's joke about the weather. There was nothing obviously strange about her, and yet she carried secrets that defied explanation. The merger announcement came exactly 2 weeks later. Just as Elena had predicted, Mr. Chen called an all-staff meeting on a Tuesday afternoon. Everyone crowded into the main conference room, curious and a bit anxious. The energy in the room shifted when 2 executives from a larger firm walked in, carrying leather folders and wearing expensive suits. "This is an exciting opportunity," Mr. Chen began, his smile a bit too wide. "We've been in discussions with Morrison and Associates, and they're interested in bringing our firm into their portfolio. This means more resources, bigger projects, and growth potential for all of us." The Morrison executives took turns talking about synergy and expanded markets and innovative approaches. They made it all sound wonderful. David looked around the room and saw his colleagues nodding, some of them actually looking excited. They were buying into every word. But David kept thinking about what Elena had said. Half the people in this room would lose their jobs. He glanced over at her. She was sitting in the back corner, her face carefully neutral, but when their eyes met, she gave him the smallest shake of her head. During the question period, most people asked softball questions about timelines and new project opportunities. David raised his hand, his heart pounding. What happens to our current staff? He asked, will there be any restructuring? One of the Morrison executives smiled smoothly. Of course, there will be some organizational adjustments as we integrate operations. But we're committed to retaining top talent. That's not really an answer, David pressed. How many positions will be eliminated? The room went quiet. Mr. Chen looked uncomfortable. The executive's smile tightened. We're still finalizing those details. But I can assure you, any changes will be handled professionally and with appropriate compensation packages. After the meeting, several colleagues pulled David aside. Why were you so negative? One asked, this could be great for us. Another person was more direct. You almost made us look bad in front of those executives. What's your problem? David didn't have a good answer. How could he explain that a woman who'd worked there for less than 2 months had somehow predicted this entire scenario? Over the next few weeks, Elena continued her pattern of whispered warnings. She told David which projects would get approved and which would be quietly shelved. She mentioned that their IT system would crash on a specific Thursday, and it did. Right down to the hour. She warned him that a particular client was planning to take their business elsewhere. And sure enough, the cancellation email arrived 3 days later. But the predictions were getting darker, more personal. One morning, as David grabbed coffee from the break room, Elena appeared beside him. She glanced around to make sure they were alone, then leaned in close. Your colleague. The one with the red car who parks in spot 17, she whispered. Tell him to get his brakes checked today. Not tomorrow. Today. Why? David asked, but Elena was already walking away. David barely knew the guy with the red car. They maybe exchanged 10 words total. But Elena's tone had been urgent, almost desperate. After an hour of internal debate, David awkwardly approached the man's desk. Hey, this is going to sound weird, but you should really get your brakes checked. Like, today if possible. The man looked at him like he was crazy. My brakes are fine. Just, please. Trust me on this. That evening, David got a text from an office group chat. The guy with the red car had taken his vehicle to a mechanic just to prove David wrong. The mechanic found that his brake line was nearly severed. Another week of normal driving and it would have failed completely, probably on the highway. The man called David that night, his voice shaking. How did you know? Did you see something wrong with my car? David had no answer. He certainly couldn't tell the truth. Then a mysterious coworker had whispered a warning that saved his life. The next day, the man with the red car tried to thank Elena directly, but she waved him off, acting like she had no idea what he was talking about. But David saw the flash of relief in her eyes. She'd saved someone, and she knew it. David started seeking Elena out more often. During lunch breaks, he'd sit near her in the break room. After work, he'd linger by her desk, hoping for more information. He became addicted to the knowledge she provided, to the feeling of being one step ahead of everyone else. Elena seemed to sense his growing dependence. One evening, she turned to him with a serious expression. You need to be careful, David. The more you know, the more responsibility you carry. Information isn't just power. It's also a burden. I don't understand, David said. You will, Eleanor replied quietly. She was right. The knowledge did become a burden. David started noticing things he wished he could ignore. He knew which colleagues were looking for other jobs, even though they smiled and acted committed. He knew which projects were doomed to fail before they even started. He knew about the CFO's personal problems that everyone else thought were just a long vacation. One night, working late again, David finally asked the question that had been haunting him. Elena, why are you telling me all of this? Why me specifically? Elena was quiet for a long time. She saved her work, closed her laptop, and turned to face him. The office was dark except for their desk lamps, creating little islands of light in the empty space. Because you're careful, she said finally. You think before you act. You don't gossip or show off what you know. And because, she hesitated, because I needed someone to know that I'm real. That what I'm going through is real. What do you mean? David asked, confused. Elena looked around the empty office, then rolled her chair closer to his. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I need to tell you something, David. Something that's going to sound impossible. But before I do, I need you to promise me that you'll hear me out completely before you react. Can you do that? David nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. I'm not who you think I am, Elena began. I mean, I'm Elena. That's my real name. But I'm not from the Berlin office. I'm not really from anywhere that makes sense. I shouldn't even be here, in this office, in this time. Something happened to me, something that wasn't supposed to be possible. And now I'm stuck, and every day I'm here, I'm making things worse. And the worst part is, there are people looking for me. People who want to fix what I've broken. And when they find me, David, they're going to find you too. Because you're part of this now. You're part of the problem. David stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. It sounded like the beginning of a confession, or maybe a breakdown. Elena, what are you talking about? What people? What problem? But before she could answer, they both heard it. The sound of the elevator opening on their floor. Footsteps in the hallway. At 9:30 at night, when the building should have been almost empty, Elena's face went pale. She grabbed David's arm, her fingers digging in hard. Don't tell them anything about me, she whispered urgently. No matter what they ask, promise me. A man appeared in the doorway of their office area. The man who walked into their office area wasn't someone David had ever seen before. He wore a gray suit that looked expensive but unremarkable. The kind of outfit designed to blend in rather than stand out. He was maybe 40 years old, with short dark hair and the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. But his eyes were sharp, taking in everything about the room in a single sweep. Good evening. The man said, his voice friendly but formal. I'm looking for the HR department. I seem to have gotten turned around. David felt Elena's grip tighten on his arm before she let go and rolled her chair back to a normal distance. She was trying to look casual, but David could see the tension in her shoulders. HR is on the 3rd floor, David said, keeping his voice steady. This is the design department. My mistake, the man said with a polite smile. But he didn't leave immediately. His eyes moved from David to Elena and back again. Working late, I see. Dedicated employees. Your company is lucky to have you. There was something odd about the way he said it, like he was testing them somehow. Elena had turned back to her computer and was typing, deliberately ignoring him. David forced himself to smile, just finishing up some projects. The elevators are back by the main entrance, of course. Thank you. The man nodded and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. But David noticed he didn't head toward the elevators. The footsteps stopped somewhere down the hall, like he was waiting. David and Elena sat in silence for several long minutes. Neither of them moved. Finally, they heard the elevator ding and the sound of doors closing. Elena let out a breath she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking as she shut down her computer. We need to leave now, but not together. You go first. I'll wait 15 minutes and take a different exit. Elena, who was that? David demanded. What's going on? I can't explain here. Meet me tomorrow. Not at work. There's a coffee shop on Maple Street, the one with the blue awning. Be there at 7 in the morning. Please, David. I'll explain everything then. She looked genuinely scared. And that frightened David more than anything else. Elena, who always seemed so calm and controlled, who whispered secrets with complete confidence, was afraid. David barely slept that night. He kept thinking about the man in the gray suit, about the way he looked at them, about Elena's reaction. None of it made sense. By 6:30 the next morning, he was already dressed and heading to the coffee shop on Maple Street. He got there early and chose a table in the back corner where they could talk privately. His coffee went cold as he waited, checking his watch every few minutes. 7 came and went. Then 7:15. David was starting to worry that Elena wouldn't show up when she finally walked through the door. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept either. She ordered a coffee and sat down across from him, wrapping her hands around the cup like she was trying to warm herself. Even though the shop was heated, I need to show you something, Elena said quietly. But before I do, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you will change how you see everything. Your job, your life, reality itself. Once you know, you can't unknow it. Are you sure you want this? David thought about it. Part of him wanted to stand up, walk away, go back to his simple, predictable life. But he knew he was already too deep. The man in the gray suit, Elena's predictions, all of it had already changed things. There was no going back. Show me, he said. Elena pulled out a laptop from her bag. It was old and worn, with stickers peeling off the cover. She opened it, typed in a password, and turned the screen toward David. What he saw made his stomach drop. The screen showed news articles, but the dates were wrong. They were dated months in the future. December, January, February. Articles about events that hadn't happened yet. A major company merger that would shock the business world. A storm that would cause massive damage to the coast. Political changes that seemed impossible. Ibel, how did you make these? David asked, his voice barely working. Is this some kind of editing software? Elena shook her head. She clicked on one of the articles, and it took them to what looked like a real news website. She clicked on another and another. Each one appeared legitimate, complete with photos and detailed reporting about events that were supposedly months away. These aren't fake, Elena said quietly. They're real articles from real news sites. The problem is, they're from the wrong time. She pulled up another folder on the laptop. This one contained internal documents from their company, emails, memos, meeting notes. But again, the dates were all wrong. They were from the future. David saw his own name in several of them, messages he hadn't written yet, meetings he hadn't attended. I don't understand, David said. Even though a terrifying explanation was starting to form in his mind, Elena took a deep breath. 3 years from now, or I guess I should say 3 years from where I started, there was a private research project. It was funded by some very wealthy people who wanted an edge in the financial markets. They weren't interested in science for its own sake. They wanted to predict stock movements, company decisions, anything that would give them an advantage. She paused to sip her coffee, her hands still shaking slightly. They recruited people like me, scientists, analysts, people good with data. They told us we were working on advanced quantum computing, developing AI that could predict market trends. And that was partially true. But what they were really building was something else entirely, something that could access information across time. David wanted to interrupt, to tell her this was impossible, but the evidence was right there on the screen in front of him. I was part of the testing phase, Elena continued. They had built this device, this machine that created what they called temporal displacement. They said it was just for sending data back and forth, viewing information from different time points. But something went wrong during one of the tests. Instead of just accessing information from the future, I got pulled backward. 18 months backward, to be specific. I ended up here, in your present, which is my past. That's impossible, David finally said. But his voice lacked conviction. I know how it sounds, Elena said. Believe me, I know. But think about it, David. How else could I possibly know all those things? The Singapore company bankruptcy, the merger, your colleague's car problems. I'm not psychic. I'm not incredibly intuitive. I simply remember these things because I already lived through them once in my timeline. You took the Singapore job. The merger went through without anyone questioning it. That colleague had an accident on the highway. David's mind was racing. But if you're from the future, why don't you just tell people? Why all the secrecy and whispers? Because every time I change something, I create what they call a temporal anomaly. Every person whose life I alter, every event I prevent, it creates ripples in the timeline. And those ripples can be detected. That's what that man last night was doing. He works for a government agency that monitors temporal disturbances. They've been tracking the changes I've made, and they're closing in on me. She pulled up another file on the laptop, this one showing what looked like technical readouts. Graphs with strange patterns and spikes. Every time I warn someone, every time I change an outcome, it shows up on their instruments. They can't travel through time themselves, not yet, but they can track when someone else does it. And I've been here for months, making changes, creating disturbances. I might as well have been setting off fireworks announcing my presence. David sat back in his chair, trying to process everything. Why did you tell me all of this? Why not just stay quiet and avoid detection? Elena's expression softened. Because I was lonely. David, being trapped in the wrong time, knowing things you can't share, watching events unfold that you remember differently, it's isolating in a way I can't describe. And you were safe. You're careful, thoughtful. You don't gossip. I thought I could trust you with small things, little warnings here and there. But then I started asking questions. David finished. Then you started looking into me. Elena corrected gently. David felt his face flush with embarrassment and guilt. You knew I was researching you? Elena nodded slowly. Of course I knew. Every search you made, every inquiry you sent to the Berlin office, every time you tried to access my employee records, I knew because of my original timeline. You never did any of those things. We barely spoke to each other. You were just the quiet guy who sat next to me. But in this timeline, because I kept warning you, kept sharing information, you became curious. And that curiosity created digital footprints, traces that their monitoring systems could detect. She pulled up another screen on her laptop, showing what looked like a network of connections. Lines connecting dots, spreading out like a spider web. This is what they see when they track temporal anomalies. Each dot is a change from the original timeline. See this cluster here? That's you. Your declined job offer, your questions at the merger meeting, your warning to your colleague about his breaks. Every action you took based on my information created a ripple. And all those ripples point back to one source, me. David stared at the web of connections. Feeling sick, so I led them to you. I'm the reason that man showed up last night. You didn't know, Elena said quietly. And honestly, they would have found me eventually anyway. I've been here too long. Changed too many things. I got careless. Or maybe I just got tired of pretending none of this was real. Either way, we're both on the radar now. What do they want? David asked. These people tracking you. What happens when they find you? Elena's face grew grim. I don't know exactly. In my timeline, I never heard about anyone being pulled backward in time. So I have no reference for what happens next. But based on what I learned about the project, I can guess. They'll want to study me, figure out how the displacement happened. They'll want to know what I've changed, what information I've shared, and most importantly, they'll want to contain the damage. Contain how? By minimizing my impact. That might mean isolating me somewhere, or it might mean trying to reverse the changes I've made. Or, she trailed off. Not finishing the thought, David leaned forward. Or what? Elena met his eyes. Or they might decide the easiest solution is to make sure I never existed in this timeline at all. I don't know if that's even possible, but if it is, they'd have every reason to try. I'm a walking paradox, David, an anomaly that shouldn't exist from their perspective. The cleanest solution would be to erase me entirely. The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm, too crowded even though there were only a handful of other customers. David looked around nervously, half expecting to see the man in the gray suit watching them from another table. What are you going to do? He asked. I've been thinking about that a lot, Elena said. She closed the laptop and slid it back into her bag. I have two choices. I can keep running, keep hiding, keep making small changes and hoping they never pinpoint my exact location. Or I can stop running and face whatever comes next. You can't just give up, David protested. It's not giving up, Elena said. It's accepting reality. I've been fighting this for months, David, always looking over my shoulder, always afraid of making too big a change, always isolated and alone. And you know what the worst part is? Every day I stay here, every change I'm potentially causing more damage to the timeline. What if one of my warnings prevents something that was supposed to happen? What if I've already created bigger problems down the road? She pulled a small USB drive from her pocket and placed it on the table between them. That's why I wanted to meet you this morning, to give you this and to say goodbye. David stared at the tiny device. What is it? Everything I know about the next 18 months, every major event, every company decision, every piece of information that might be useful. Stock movements, natural disasters, political changes, all of it. I spent the last 3 nights compiling it all. Why are you giving this to me? Because you'll use it responsibly, Elena said. I've watched you these past months. You're not greedy. When I gave you information, you used it to help people, to protect yourself and others. You didn't try to profit from it or show off what you knew. You're exactly the kind of person who should have this knowledge. David pushed the USB drive back toward her. I don't want it. Come on. Elena, there has to be another way. We can figure this out together. Elena smiled sadly. You're a good person, David. Better than I deserve after dragging you into this mess. But this is my problem, not yours. This morning, I'm going to go to the police station and turn myself in. I'm going to ask to speak to federal authorities and explain who I am and what happened. Maybe they'll help me. Maybe they'll lock me up. But at least it will be over and you'll be safe. That's insane, David said, his voice rising slightly. The barista glanced their way, and he lowered his voice. You can't just walk into a police station and tell them you're from the future. They'll think you're having a mental breakdown. Maybe, Elena agreed. But I have proof. I have the laptop, the files, knowledge of events that haven't happened yet, eventually. Someone will take me seriously, and I'll be connected with whoever is tracking temporal anomalies. Mig,